What does it take to stop an army that's never lost? An army so terrifying that entire cities surrender the moment their scouts appear on the horizon. An army that's conquered everything from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. For 40 years, the Mongol war machine had rolled across the medieval world like an unstoppable force of nature, leaving smoking ruins and shattered kingdoms in its wake. But on the 3rd of September, 1260, 20,000 Mongol warriors rode into a valley in Palestine, expecting another easy victory. What they got instead was the most perfectly executed military trap in medieval history. And the man who orchestrated it? A former slave who'd spent his entire life preparing for this exact moment. This is the story of how brilliance, patience, and one absolutely genius plan finally brought the Mongols to their knees. Let's start by understanding exactly what made the Mongols so utterly dominant, because you can't appreciate how incredible this victory was without grasping just how terrifying these warriors were. The Mongol military system was basically medieval perfection wrapped in pure terror. Every single warrior could fire 20 arrows per minute whilst riding at full gallop. Think about that for a second. 20 arrows per minute. Whilst controlling a horse at top speed, that's absolutely mental. Their organization was equally brilliant. They used a decimal system that organized armies into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. This meant battlefield communication was incredibly precise. A commander could coordinate maneuvers across 50 miles of battlefield using nothing but flags, horns, and mounted messengers. It was like having a medieval military internet, and it made them devastatingly effective. But here's what really made them unstoppable. Psychological warfare. When Mongol scouts appeared on your city walls, you had two choices. Surrender immediately and maybe, just maybe, survive as their subjects. Or resist and watch them slaughter every living thing within your walls. Men, women, children, pets, everything. They weren't making idle threats either. Everyone had heard the stories. Everyone knew what happened to cities that fought back. This system had conquered everything from Korea to Hungary. In 1258, they demonstrated their power by completely destroying Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world and one of the most advanced cities on earth. They'd executed the caliph by rolling him in carpets and trampling him with horses. The message was crystal clear. Nothing and no one could stand against Mongol might. Resistance was not only futile, it was suicidal. Now, let's talk about because these weren't your average medieval soldiers. They weren't conscripted peasants fighting because some lord told them to. They weren't knights fighting for land and honor. The Mamluks was something entirely different, and frankly, quite extraordinary. They were warrior slaves, purchased as children from the steppes and Caucasus Mountains. Then, subjected to the most intensive military training program the medieval world had ever seen. From age 7 onwards, a Mamluk recruit learned one thing and one thing only. Mounted combat, not farming, not politics, not crafts. Just warfare. They practiced archery until they could split arrows at full gallop. They trained with swords until blade work became pure instinct. Most crucially, they mastered the art of coordinated cavalry charges that could shatter infantry formations like glacis. Here's where it gets fascinating. Whilst Mongol strength came from adaptability and speed across vast distances, Mamluk power was concentrated specialization. A Mongol warrior was a brilliant generalist who could fight anywhere under any conditions. A Mamluk was a precisioned instrument designed for one specific purpose: destroying enemy cavalry in close combat. It's like comparing a Swiss Army knife to a perfectly balanced sword. Both are deadly, but in very different ways. By 1260, the strategic situation for the Islamic world couldn't have been more desperate. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, controlled everything from Iran to Syria. His lieutenant, a veteran commander named Qutuz, led the advance force pushing toward Egypt with explicit orders: eliminate the Mamluk Sultan and complete Mongol domination of the Middle East. Game over for Islam. Sultan Qutuz, the Mamluk leader, knew the maths were brutal. The Mongols had never lost a major battle. They commanded superior numbers, better logistics, and 40 years of psychological momentum. Every previous Islamic army had crumbled before their advance, like sandcastles before a wave. But Qutuz possessed one advantage the Mongols had never faced before: commanders who actually understood their tactical patterns. Enter Babe. This bloke had studied Mongol methods during their conquest of Syria. He'd watched, learned, and analyzed, whilst others had simply panicked and fled. He'd observed their preference for drawing enemies into open terrain, where their mobility advantage became decisive. He'd noted their confidence in pursuing retreating forces, a tactic that had delivered countless victories across 3 continents. Most importantly, he'd identified the one scenario where Mongol advantages became vulnerabilities. In broken terrain, where their formations couldn't maintain perfect coordination, where pursuit became channeled rather than fluid. The unstoppable Mongol machine might finally meet its match, and Baybars had found the perfect place to test his theory. A valley with a spring called Ain Jalut. Dawn broke over that valley on the 3rd of September, 1260. Qutuz's Mongol vanguard crested the hills overlooking the springs, their horses snorting in the cool morning air. Below them, they spotted exactly what they expected. A Mamluk force positioned near the water source, maybe 3,000 cavalry in loose formation. Qutuz probably smiled. This would be over by midday. Just another quick victory to add to the list. The Mongols descended into the valley with their standard battle formation. Heavy cavalry in the center, light archers on the flanks, reserve units positioned to exploit any breakthrough. It was the same arrangement that had crushed armies from Beijing to Budapest. Why change what works perfectly? As the distance closed to bow range, something unexpected happened. The Mamluk commander raised his banner and wheeled his horse around. The entire Mamluk force began pulling back from the springs. Not in panic, mind you, but in what appeared to be an organized retreat. Baybars had begun the performance of his life. Now, here's what made this moment absolutely brilliant from a psychological perspective. Mongol doctrine emphasized pursuit of retreating enemies. Every Mongol officer had been trained that fleeing forces were vulnerable forces. When your enemy runs, you chase them down and destroy them piecemeal before they can regroup. It was Mongol Tactics 101. Qutuz had personally witnessed this tactic succeed dozens of times. At the Battle of Mohi, fleeing Hungarian knights had been slaughtered by the thousands during their retreat. At Legnica, Polish cavalry had been annihilated whilst attempting to withdraw. The pattern was always the same. Retreat equals defeat. But Baybars understood something crucial about Mongol psychology. Their confidence and pursuit came from fighting enemies who retreated in genuine panic. Broken formations, scattered units, individual warriors fleeing for their lives. What Qutuz was seeing looked different, but not different enough to trigger suspicion. The Mamluk retreat moved at exactly the right speed, fast enough to suggest fear, slow enough to remain tempting. Baybars kept his formations intact but loose, creating the impression of an army trying to maintain discipline whilst falling back under pressure. The chase began. Mongol light cavalry surged forward, their composite bows sending volleys of arrows toward the retreating Mamluk. Some arrows found their mark and Mamluk warriors tumbled from their saddles. The sight of enemy casualties confirmed what Qutuz already believed. This was a real retreat, not a feint. Time to finish them off. Mile by mile, the Mongols pushed deeper into the valley. Their formation began to stretch as faster units pulled ahead and slower ones fell behind. The tight coordination that made Mongol armies so devastating started to loosen as the pursuit gained momentum. It was natural, inevitable even, but it was also exactly what Baybars wanted. Baybars maintained the illusion perfectly. His rear guard fought just hard enough to seem desperate, just poorly enough to encourage continued pursuit. When Mongol pressure intensified, he ordered small groups to break away from the main force, simulating the kind of unit breakdown that preceded total collapse. Every detail was calculated to feed Mongol expectations. 3 miles into the valley, Qutuz made the fatal decision. Seeing what appeared to be a disintegrating enemy force, he committed his reserves to the pursuit. The entire Mongol army was now strung out across the valley floor, their attention focused entirely on the retreating Mamluks ahead. They'd completely forgotten about maintaining defensive awareness. Why would they need it? They were winning. That's when Baybars triggered the trap. Hidden in the hills on both sides of the valley, 2 massive Mamluk formations had been waiting in absolute silence. Sultan Qutuz commanded the eastern force, nearly 5,000 heavy cavalry. Baybars' lieutenant controlled the western group, another 4,000 mounted warriors. At the predetermined signal, both forces erupted from concealment simultaneously. The psychological impact was devastating. One moment, the Mongols were pursuing a beaten enemy through an empty valley. The next, they found themselves surrounded by fresh cavalry charging from 3 directions at once. It was every commander's nightmare made real. Mongol battlefield communications, so effective in open terrain, collapsed in the chaos. Unit commanders couldn't see their superiors through the dust and confusion. Horn signals were drowned out by the thunder of hooves and clash of weapons. The decimal system that had coordinated armies across continents became useless in the span of minutes. But here's where Mamluk training superiority became decisive. Whilst Mongol warriors excelled at mobile archery and coordinated maneuvers, Mamluks had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this scenario. Close quarters mounted combat where individual skill determined survival. In the brutal melee that followed, Mamluk warriors systematically dismantled their opponents. Their heavier armor absorbed Mongol arrow strikes, their superior swordsmanship carved through Mongol formations. Most crucially, their horses were trained specifically for the chaos of cavalry combat. WHILST. Mongol mounts were bred for speed and endurance across open ground. In this valley, on this day, that difference was everything. Kitbuka realized too late that he'd been completely out. The veteran commander tried desperately to rally his scattered forces, but the tactical situation had become hopeless. Surrounded, outnumbered in the immediate combat zone, and caught completely off guard, the Mongol army began to disintegrate. When Kitbuka fell with a Mamluk lance through his chest, Mongol resistance collapsed entirely. The survivors who escaped that valley carried more than news of defeat back to Damascus. They carried the death of an idea that had dominated the medieval world for 4 decades. For the first time since Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes, a major Mongol army had been completely destroyed in open battle. Not defeated through siege warfare or guerrilla tactics, but annihilated in the kind of direct confrontation where Mongol superiority was supposed to be absolute. The strategic implications rippled across 3 continents within months. In Europe, where kings had been preparing for inevitable Mongol invasion, the news sparked celebrations from Paris to Vienna. The unstoppable force had finally been stopped. In the Islamic world, Ain Jalut triggered a renaissance of resistance. Syrian cities that had submitted to Mongol rule began expelling their occupiers. From Aleppo to Homs, local commanders who'd accepted Hulag's authority suddenly found the courage to rebel. But the psychological impact went deeper than politics. The Mongol Empire had built its expansion on a simple premise. Resistance was futile because Mongol victory was inevitable. That premise died in the dust of Ain Jalut. Hulagu Khan, receiving word of the disaster from his capital in Iran, faced an impossible choice. He could commit his remaining forces to avenging Kitbuka's defeat, but that would leave his eastern territories vulnerable to Chinese rebellion. Or he could consolidate his existing conquests and accept that Mongol expansion had reached its limit. He chose consolidation. The Mongol war machine that had rolled from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea ground to a permanent halt at the borders of Egypt. Here's what made Ain Jalut different from other Mongol setbacks. The Mongols had suffered defeats before, but always in circumstances that could be explained away. Bad weather at the invasion of Japan, overextended supply lines in Eastern Europe, political instability following a great Khan's death. Ain Jalut offered no such excuses. Perfect weather, adequate supplies, unified command structure, and veteran troops led by an experienced general. The Mamluks had simply outfought them using superior tactics and training. The battle proved that Mongol military dominance wasn't based on supernatural invincibility, but on specific tactical advantages that could be countered by the right opponent under the right circumstances. Baybars had identified those circumstances and exploited them with devastating precision. Within a generation, the unified Mongol Empire had fractured into competing the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Yuan dynasty, and the Chagatai Khanate. All claimed legitimacy, but none possessed the overwhelming military superiority that had made Mongol conquest seem inevitable. The age of Mongol expansion was over. The age of Mongol decline had begun, and it all started in a valley called Ain Jalut, where one brilliant commander proved that even the world's most feared army could be destroyed by the right trap at the right moment. The 3rd of September, 1260 marked the day tactical genius triumphed over military reputation. Baybars had accomplished what no general before him had managed, turning Mongol strengths into fatal weaknesses. through perfect deception and flawless execution. He'd studied his enemy, understood their psychology, and created the one scenario where their advantages became liabilities. That's not just military brilliance. That's strategic genius of the highest order. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most brilliant tactical victories, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories where smart strategy changed the entire course of history. There are countless other battles where cleverness beat brute force, and trust me, you'll want to hear about them. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the best weapon isn't the biggest army, it's the sharpest mind.